The greatest regrets in life are rarely born in moments of failure. They are born in moments we never thought would matter. Rain hammered against the windshield as Ethan Whitmore loosened his tie with trembling hands. The city lights of downtown Chicago dissolving into streaks of gold and white through the water on the glass. Less than 12 hours earlier, he had buried the only man who had ever believed he could build something extraordinary. His father was gone. His board of directors was already questioning his leadership. The empire they had spent decades creating suddenly felt like a cold monument with no soul left inside it. For the first time in years, the billionaire CEO didn't drive back to his penthouse overlooking Lake Michigan. He drove with no destination at all, letting grief choose the roads while the storm swallowed the city. Across town, Naomi Carter zipped her worn Navy jacket against the wind as she stepped out of St. Mary's Community Hospital after finishing another exhausting double shift. At 29, she had mastered the art of hiding fatigue behind a warm smile. Patients remembered her kindness long after they forgot their medication schedules, but kindness didn't pay Chicago rent, and it certainly didn't erase overdue utility bills. She checked the balance on her phone before slipping it back into her pocket. Just enough for groceries if she skipped dinner herself. It wasn't the first time. It probably wouldn't be the last. Thunder rolled overhead as she hurried toward the bus stop, only to notice a black luxury sedan sitting awkwardly near the curb with its hazard lights blinking through the rain. At first she kept walking. Expensive cars belonged to people with expensive solutions. But something about the stillness inside the vehicle made her slow down. She knocked gently on the driver's window. No answer. After another knock, the window lowered halfway, revealing a man whose expensive suit looked as though he had forgotten he was wearing it. His blue eyes were red with exhaustion rather than anger, and the sharp confidence expected from someone of his status had completely disappeared beneath quiet heartbreak. "Sir, are you okay?" Naomi asked softly. Ethan looked at her as though he had forgotten how to answer ordinary questions. "I don't think I am," he admitted with a weary smile that barely existed. She noticed the untouched bottle of water on the passenger seat and the funeral program folded beside it. She didn't ask for details. Sometimes compassion began by respecting silence. "You shouldn't stay here all night," she said. "Storms have a way of making heavy days feel even heavier." Ethan let out a faint laugh, the first genuine sound he had made since sunrise. "That's surprisingly wise." Naomi shrugged. "Life teaches some lessons whether we ask for them or not." For several quiet minutes, they talked like two strangers who expected never to meet again. No titles, no company names, no bank accounts, just two people carrying invisible weight through the same rainy night. Neither of them realized that before dawn, one unexpected decision born from grief, kindness, and human vulnerability would quietly begin changing both of their lives forever. Naomi left before the first hint of sunrise painted the Chicago skyline, quietly closing the apartment door behind her after making certain Ethan had finally fallen asleep on the couch. She had accepted nothing except the peace of knowing that a grieving stranger was no longer alone on the hardest night of his life. On the kitchen counter, she placed a handwritten note beside a fresh cup of coffee that had long since cooled. It read, "Whatever you are carrying today, I hope tomorrow feels a little lighter. Take care of yourself." She never signed her last name, never asked for his phone number, and never imagined they would cross paths again. Ethan woke nearly an hour later to unfamiliar silence. His headache lingered, but the crushing weight that had followed him since the funeral somehow felt different. The apartment was empty except for the note resting beside the untouched coffee. He read it twice, then folded the paper carefully instead of throwing it away. For reasons he could not explain, the words felt more valuable than every sympathy card waiting unopened in his penthouse mailbox. By the time his driver arrived, Ethan had already returned to the world that expected him to be flawless. Cameras flashed outside Whitmore Technologies headquarters as reporters shouted questions about the company's future. Board members greeted him with polished smiles that never reached their eyes. Financial forecasts replaced condolences within minutes. Everyone wanted something from the billionaire. No one asked whether he had slept. Meanwhile, Naomi returned to the rhythm of ordinary survival. She worked extra shifts at the hospital, picked up weekend hours at a neighborhood grocery store, and carefully stretched every dollar across rent, groceries, gas, and student loan payments. Life had taught her that stability was built one paycheck at a time. 6 weeks passed before the first quiet sign appeared. At first, she blamed exhaustion when the smell of coffee suddenly made her nauseous. Then she noticed the calendar on her refrigerator. She counted the dates once. Then again. Her heart beat faster with every calculation. Sitting alone in her tiny bathroom, she stared at the small pregnancy test resting on the edge of the sink. Outside, an elevated train rattled past the apartment building, shaking the windows exactly as it did every morning. But inside the room, everything seemed completely still. 2 blue lines appeared. Naomi covered her mouth as tears gathered in her eyes. They were not tears of shame. They were tears born from fear, uncertainty, and the overwhelming realization that her future had changed forever. She sat there for nearly an hour, thinking about the stranger whose first name she barely knew. Ethan. She remembered his tired smile, the funeral program, the quiet sadness in his voice, and the kindness he had shown after waking enough to thank her for simply staying. She could search for him, she realized. Someone with a luxury sedan and tailored suits could not be impossible to find. But every instinct told her that building a child's future upon assumptions and unexpected obligations would not be fair to anyone involved. If fate ever intended their paths to cross again, it would happen honestly. Until then, this new life was her responsibility. Naomi gently rested one hand over her stomach and whispered through trembling breath, "I do not know what tomorrow looks like, little one, but I promise you will never wonder whether you were loved from the very beginning." 5 years slipped by with the quiet determination that only ordinary heroes ever truly understood. Every morning before the sun rose above Chicago, Naomi Carter packed 2 lunches instead of one, buttoned a little jacket around her son's shoulders, and whispered the same words before locking the apartment door. "We may not have everything we want, Mason, but we will always have enough love to keep moving." Little Mason Carter smiled every single time, his bright brown eyes carrying a warmth that made complete strangers smile back without realizing why. At 5 years old, he had already learned to say thank you before receiving help, to hold doors open for elderly neighbors, and to wave at every crossing guard on the walk to kindergarten. Naomi often wondered whether kindness could be inherited from someone a child had never even known. She worked weekdays as a patient care technician at the community hospital and delivered groceries several evenings each week after Mason fell asleep under the watchful eye of Mrs. Henderson, the retired schoolteacher who lived downstairs. Money remained tight, but every bill was paid one careful decision at a time. Some nights dinner was homemade vegetable soup stretched across 3 days. Some birthdays meant secondhand toys wrapped with first-class love instead of expensive paper. Yet Mason never complained. When another child once asked why his backpack looked old, he simply smiled and answered, "My mom says taking care of things makes them last longer." Across the city, Ethan Whitmore had become the face of one of America's fastest-growing technology companies. Business magazines praised his leadership. Financial networks analyzed every acquisition. His company expanded into new markets from Seattle to Boston, while his personal fortune climbed into the billions. Yet success had become strangely quiet. The penthouse overlooking Lake Michigan felt larger every year. Important dinners blurred together. Charity galas ended with polite applause and empty conversations. Although he remained respected, the warmth people admired in public interviews rarely followed him home. Only one small piece of paper never left his private desk drawer. Every few months, he unfolded the handwritten note left by the woman whose last name he had never learned. Whenever difficult decisions threatened to harden his heart, he read the simple sentence again. "Whatever you are carrying today, I hope tomorrow feels a little lighter." His executive assistant once asked why he refused to replace the worn piece of paper with a scanned copy. Ethan simply smiled and said, "Some things lose their meaning when they become too convenient." One crisp October afternoon, Naomi received an unexpected call from Mason's elementary school. Panic tightened her chest as she rushed across town, imagining fevers, broken bones, or playground accidents. Instead, she found Mason sitting quietly outside the principal's office with a coloring book resting on his lap. His teacher greeted Naomi with a puzzled expression rather than concern. "Your son is perfectly fine," she explained. "He just insisted another student should receive the school's new winter coat because he said they looked colder than he did." Naomi looked down at her son, whose own jacket had been carefully patched twice at the elbows. Mason shrugged with innocent sincerity. "Mom, mine still keeps me warm." Naomi knelt beside him, tears quietly filling her eyes. She hugged him tightly, unaware that only a few miles away, fate had already begun arranging another meeting that neither she nor Ethan could possibly see coming. The sharp autumn wind swept colorful leaves across the entrance of Chicago Children's Medical Center as parents hurried through the sliding glass doors with backpacks, strollers, and worried expressions. Naomi tightened the scarf around Mason's neck before taking his small hand. His cough had lingered for nearly a week, and although he insisted he felt fine, she could never ignore the quiet fear every parent carried whenever their child became sick. Inside the bright pediatric waiting room, cartoon murals covered the walls while the smell of fresh coffee drifted from a volunteer station nearby. Naomi checked in at the reception desk and quietly calculated how much the insurance copayment would leave for groceries that week. Mason, however, seemed completely unconcerned. He wandered only a few feet away, fascinated by a colorful aquarium where tiny tropical fish darted through artificial coral. "Do not go too far," Naomi reminded him with a smile. "I will stay where you can see me," Mason promised. At that very moment, another entrance opened across the lobby. Ethan Whitmore stepped inside surrounded by 2 security personnel and his executive assistant. He had come to announce a multi-million-dollar donation that would fund a new pediatric research center. Cameras were already gathering near the auditorium, and hospital administrators hurried toward him with carefully prepared speeches. Ethan smiled politely, shaking hands and thanking doctors, but his attention wandered toward the families filling the waiting area. Wealth had introduced him to remarkable opportunities, yet places like this always reminded him that no amount of money could spare every family from worry. As the hospital president began explaining the afternoon schedule, a small movement caught Ethan's eye. An elderly volunteer carrying a large box of donated children's books stumbled when one of the cardboard flaps suddenly gave way. Books scattered across the polished floor, sliding in every direction. Before any adult reacted, a little boy ran over without hesitation. Mason knelt on the floor, gathering books one by one with careful hands. "These belong to the kids," he said warmly. "We should pick them up before somebody steps on them." Ethan watched silently as the volunteer smiled through grateful eyes. "Thank you, young man." Most people walked past. Mason simply shrugged. "My mom says if you are close enough to help, then you are close enough to care." Those words landed somewhere deep inside Ethan. They sounded strangely familiar, carrying the same quiet wisdom he had once heard on a rainy night years ago. Without thinking, he walked toward the boy and knelt beside him, helping stack the remaining books into the damaged box. "You are pretty fast," Ethan said with a gentle smile. Mason looked up confidently. "My mom says teamwork is faster than showing off." Ethan laughed, genuinely amused. "Your mother sounds like a very smart woman." "She is," Mason answered proudly. "She helps people at the hospital every day, and she still makes the best macaroni and cheese in Chicago." Across the lobby, Naomi finished signing insurance paperwork and turned around just in time to see her son talking with a tall man in an expensive navy suit. Her heart skipped for reasons she could not explain. She could not clearly see the man's face from where she stood, but something about the way he smiled at Mason stirred a memory she had buried years ago beneath responsibility, long workdays, and quiet sacrifice. Neither of them realized that destiny had finally placed all 3 lives into the same room again, and this time, none of them would simply walk away. Naomi called Mason back with a gentle wave just as the pediatric nurse appeared in the waiting area, holding a clipboard. Mason smiled politely at the stranger who had helped gather the books. "Thank you for helping too, mister," he said before jogging toward his mother. Ethan watched the little boy disappear into the crowd, surprised by the unexpected sense of loss that followed such a brief encounter. The hospital president lightly touched his elbow, reminding him that reporters and donors were waiting upstairs, but Ethan found himself glancing back one last time. He caught only a fleeting glimpse of a woman placing a reassuring hand on the boy's shoulder before they disappeared through a hallway leading toward the examination rooms. Something about her posture tugged at a memory that refused to fully surface. During the donation ceremony, cameras flashed while executives applauded generous promises and carefully rehearsed speeches about innovation, compassion, and the future of pediatric medicine. Ethan delivered every word with practiced confidence, yet his thoughts repeatedly drifted back to the little boy with the warm smile and surprisingly thoughtful answers. After the event concluded, he surprised his executive assistant, Claire Donovan, with an unusual request. "The child who helped the volunteer this morning," Ethan said as they walked toward the elevator. "Did anyone happen to learn his name?" Claire blinked in confusion. "I do not believe so. Should I ask hospital administration?" Ethan hesitated before nodding. "Only if it can be done respectfully. I simply wanted to send a few children's books as a thank you." Claire smiled. "That is the most unexpected assignment you have given me all year." Ethan laughed quietly, although he could not explain why it suddenly felt important. Meanwhile, Naomi and Mason left the hospital carrying reassuring news that his cough was nothing more than a seasonal infection. Relief replaced the anxiety that had weighed on her shoulders all week. As they waited for the city bus outside the hospital, Mason looked up at her with unmistakable excitement. "Mom, the tall man was really nice." Naomi smiled. "Was he?" "He listened when I talked." Most grown-ups smile first because they want to leave. He smiled because he wanted to hear my answer. Naomi looked away toward the passing traffic. Children sometimes notice truths adults overlooked. "What did you talk about?" she asked. "Books, teamwork, and your macaroni and cheese." Naomi laughed despite herself. "I cannot believe you told a stranger that." Mason grinned proudly. "It is true." Several days later, Claire returned to Ethan's office carrying a slim folder. "The hospital could not release patient information," she explained, "but one of the volunteers remembered the little boy because he stayed behind to organize the books after everyone else had left. His first name is Mason." Ethan repeated the name almost absent-mindedly. Mason. It somehow felt familiar before he had ever spoken it aloud. Claire placed a photograph from the donation event on his desk, captured by one of the hospital photographers. In the background, barely visible behind the smiling child, stood a woman watching with quiet pride. Her face was partially turned away, softened by afternoon light, but something about the image stopped Ethan's breathing for a heartbeat. He reached into the bottom drawer of his desk and unfolded the handwritten note he had carried for 5 years. He stared at the graceful handwriting, then back at the photograph. The feeling was impossible to explain. It was not recognition. Not yet. It was something quieter, something deeper, as though life itself had begun whispering that a forgotten chapter was slowly finding its way back to him. The photograph refused to leave Ethan's mind. For several nights it remained on the corner of his desk long after the office lights had dimmed and the cleaning crews had gone home. He found himself studying the blurred outline of the woman standing behind Mason instead of reviewing financial reports worth hundreds of millions of dollars. There was something painfully familiar about the quiet way she watched the little boy, not with pride alone, but with the protective tenderness of someone who had fought countless unseen battles. One evening, Ethan unfolded the handwritten note again. The paper had softened with age, the edges slightly worn from years of careful handling. As he traced the elegant handwriting with his fingertips, another memory surfaced with startling clarity. Rain tapping against apartment windows. A warm cup of coffee left on a small kitchen counter. A gentle voice saying, "Storms have a way of making heavy days feel even heavier." Ethan slowly closed his eyes. The voice belonged to the woman in the photograph. He was almost certain of it now. The realization unsettled him more than any business crisis ever had. He asked Claire to arrange another visit to the Children's Hospital, officially to review the progress of the new research center. Although he quietly admitted to himself there was another reason. Meanwhile, life continued moving at its familiar pace for Naomi. She hurried between hospital shifts, school pickups, grocery deliveries, and bedtime stories, never imagining that someone from her past was slowly putting forgotten pieces together. Mason's cough had disappeared, replaced by his endless curiosity about the world. Every evening, he filled the apartment with questions that made Naomi smile despite her exhaustion. One Saturday morning, they returned to the hospital for a free community health fair, where Naomi had volunteered for years. Colorful booths lined the lobby, children laughed while nurses handed out balloons, and local businesses sponsored educational activities for families. As Naomi helped organize donated backpacks filled with school supplies, Mason wandered only a few feet away toward a robotics demonstration sponsored by Whitmore Technologies. Ethan arrived moments later with a small group of employees. This time there were no television cameras, no formal speeches, and no security barriers separating executives from families. He noticed Mason immediately. The little boy was concentrating so hard on assembling a simple robot that the tip of his tongue peeked from the corner of his mouth. Ethan smiled without realizing he had done exactly the same thing as a child whenever he worked beside his father in the garage. "You were pretty good at that," Ethan said warmly. Mason looked up with instant recognition. "You are the book helper." Ethan laughed. "I suppose I am." Before either of them could say another word, Naomi turned after hearing her son's cheerful voice. Time seemed to pause. Their eyes met across the crowded lobby, and 5 forgotten years disappeared in a single heartbeat. Ethan saw the same gentle eyes that had watched over him on the darkest night of his life. Naomi recognized the tired blue eyes that had once carried unbearable grief behind expensive clothes. Neither of them spoke for several long seconds. Finally, Ethan offered a quiet smile filled with disbelief rather than certainty. "I know you," he said softly. Naomi's breath caught as memories she had carefully locked away returned all at once. She answered with equal honesty. "Yes," she whispered. "I think you finally do." Naomi led Mason to a quieter courtyard outside the hospital where colorful pinwheels turned gently in the afternoon breeze. Ethan followed a respectful distance behind, stopping several feet away as though afraid one more step might shatter whatever fragile moment had just begun. Neither of them spoke immediately. 5 years of unanswered questions stood silently between them. Mason looked from one adult to the other with innocent curiosity. "Mom, is this your friend?" Naomi swallowed before answering. "We met a long time ago." Ethan nodded slowly. "A very long time ago." Mason smiled, satisfied with the simple explanation, before wandering toward a nearby butterfly garden where volunteers were helping children identify flowers. Naomi watched him for a moment, making certain he remained within sight. Only then did she turn back toward Ethan. "I never expected to see you again," she admitted quietly. Ethan looked down at the folded note he still carried inside his wallet. "Neither did I, but I never forgot you." Naomi seemed genuinely surprised. "You kept it." He carefully unfolded the worn piece of paper and held it where she could recognize her own handwriting. "It reminded me that kindness can find someone even on the worst day of their life." Naomi's eyes softened. She remembered writing those words before leaving the apartment at sunrise, believing they would disappear with the stranger forever. Ethan looked toward Mason, who was laughing as a butterfly landed briefly on his shoulder. "He is an incredible little boy." Naomi smiled with unmistakable pride. "He is." Ethan hesitated, choosing every word with care. "May I ask how old he is?" Naomi knew the question would come eventually. She answered honestly. "He turned 5 last spring." Ethan quietly counted the years in his mind. The dates aligned with painful precision. His heartbeat quickened, not from certainty, but from a possibility so overwhelming that he almost feared saying it aloud. "Naomi, is there something you have never told me?" She lowered her eyes for several seconds before meeting his gaze again. There was no anger in her expression, only years of quiet responsibility. "The morning after we met, I believed our lives were moving in different directions. Then I learned I was expecting a baby." Ethan felt the world around him fade into silence. Hospital announcements, children's laughter, footsteps across the courtyard. Everything seemed to disappear beneath the weight of those words. Naomi continued before he could interrupt. "I never looked for you because I did not know your last name. By the time I discovered who you were, you had become one of the most recognizable business leaders in the country. I did not want a child to become tomorrow's headline, and I never wanted anyone to believe I was asking for your money." Ethan slowly turned toward Mason again. The little boy was kneeling to help another child pick up crayons that had spilled across the sidewalk. Without hesitation, without being asked, the same instinct that had first captured Ethan's attention at the hospital. The same quiet compassion Naomi had shown him years earlier. Ethan's voice trembled almost imperceptibly. "I am not asking because I doubt your honesty." He paused, struggling to steady himself. "I am asking because if there is even a chance, I need to know the truth." Naomi nodded gently. "I understand." Neither of them spoke for another long moment before she answered with calm dignity. "If you want certainty, We can arrange a DNA test. Not because I need anything from you, Ethan. Because Mason deserves the truth about where he came from, whatever that truth may be. The DNA results arrived 8 days later in a plain white envelope that looked far too ordinary to carry a truth capable of changing 3 lives forever. Ethan sat alone in his office overlooking the Chicago skyline, the unopened envelope resting on his desk beside the faded handwritten note he had carried for 5 years. For the first time since building Whitmore Technologies, he found himself afraid of opening a document. Not because he feared disappointment, but because he knew that if the answer was yes, nothing about his future could ever remain the same. Across town, Naomi finished her shift at the hospital before picking Mason up from school. She had explained only that a kind man she had met long ago wanted to get to know them better. Mason accepted the explanation with the uncomplicated trust only children possess. He never asked difficult questions. He simply assumed that adults would tell the truth when the time was right. Late that afternoon, Ethan arrived at Naomi's apartment carrying nothing except the sealed envelope. No assistants. No lawyers. No security team. Naomi invited him inside, where the familiar scent of homemade soup filled the tiny kitchen. Mason sat at the dining table carefully coloring a picture of a lighthouse while humming softly to himself. Ethan realized he had imagined this moment countless times during the past week, yet none of those imagined conversations prepared him for the quiet reality unfolding before him. Naomi gently placed the envelope on the table between them. "Whenever you are ready," she said. Ethan opened it with unsteady hands and read the report once. Then again, the words remained exactly the same. The probability of paternity exceeded 99.9%. His vision blurred before he could finish the final sentence. He slowly lowered the paper, unable to speak. 5 birthdays. 5 Christmas mornings. 5 first days of school. 5 years of scraped knees, bedtime stories, laughter, tears, and milestones had passed without him ever knowing his son existed. The DNA result did not break his heart. Time did. Ethan looked toward Mason, who had just finished coloring and proudly held up his picture. "Mom, look. I made the lighthouse brighter because ships need help finding home." Naomi smiled through gathering tears. Ethan quietly covered his face for a moment as emotion finally overcame the control he had spent years mastering. "I cannot get those years back," he whispered. "I cannot hear his first words. I cannot hold him on the day he was born. I cannot be there for memories that already belong to someone else." Naomi gently shook her head. "No, but you can choose the memories that have not happened yet." Ethan looked at her with grateful disbelief. "After everything, you are still willing to give me that chance?" Naomi answered without hesitation. "This is not about what you deserve or what I deserve. It is about what Mason deserves." As if sensing the seriousness in the room, Mason walked over carrying his drawing. He looked curiously from his mother to Ethan before offering the picture with both hands. "You can have this if you want," he said with an innocent smile. "My teacher says people who feel sad should keep something that reminds them there is always light somewhere." Ethan accepted the drawing as though it were the most valuable gift he had ever received. In that quiet apartment, surrounded by secondhand furniture and a love that money could never purchase, the billionaire finally understood that becoming a father would not begin with a DNA report. It would begin with earning the trust of the little boy who had just handed him a lighthouse instead of a lifetime of resentment. The seasons changed quietly after that day, not through grand announcements or dramatic promises, but through ordinary moments that slowly stitched 3 lives together. Ethan never tried to replace the years he had missed with expensive gifts or impossible gestures. Instead, he arrived every Saturday morning with a baseball glove, 2 cups of hot chocolate during the colder months, and enough patience to learn who Mason already was instead of trying to shape him into someone else. Some afternoons they built model airplanes at the small kitchen table while Naomi prepared dinner nearby. Other weekends they volunteered together at the same community hospital where their paths had crossed again, organizing donated books, assembling care packages, and serving meals to families waiting beside hospital beds. Ethan discovered that fatherhood was not measured by the size of a trust fund, but by the willingness to show up again and again, even when nobody was watching. Naomi noticed the difference long before she admitted it to herself. Ethan never interrupted the routines she had spent years building. He asked before making decisions. He listened more than he spoke. He respected every sacrifice she had made without him. Trust did not return all at once. It arrived one small promise kept at a time. Months later, Mason looked up from a board game one evening and asked the question both adults knew would eventually come. "Can I call you Dad someday?" Ethan's eyes filled with quiet emotion, but he did not answer immediately. He looked at Naomi first. She smiled gently before nodding. Ethan turned back toward the little boy. "You never have to call me anything until it feels right in your heart," he said softly. Mason grinned, wrapped his small arms around Ethan's shoulders, and whispered, "It already does." Several years passed. Mason grew into a confident young man whose kindness became the quality everyone remembered first. On the evening of his high school graduation, the auditorium echoed with applause as he stepped onto the stage to deliver the student farewell address. Naomi sat in the front row wearing the same quiet smile that had carried her through every difficult season of life. Beside her, Ethan held the faded drawing of the lighthouse inside the program booklet, still carefully protected after all those years. Mason adjusted the microphone and looked across the crowd before speaking. "People often ask me what success looks like. Some think it is measured by money. Others think it is measured by titles or achievements. I grew up learning something different." He paused, finding his mother and father in the audience. "The strongest people I know never stopped showing kindness when life gave them every reason to become bitter. My mother taught me that love means standing beside someone even when nobody notices. My father taught me that it is never too late to become the person you were meant to be, as long as you are willing to stay." The auditorium fell completely silent. Ethan reached for Naomi's hand, and this time she did not pull away. She simply held it. Not because the past had disappeared, but because healing had finally become stronger than regret. As Mason accepted his diploma beneath the bright auditorium lights, Ethan quietly remembered the rainy night that had changed everything. He had once believed his